So good morning, good evening to those of you on the other side of the Commonwealth. I'm delighted to welcome you all here today and delighted to be joined by 5 speakers who I know are going to bring a wealth of expertise to our discussion today. My name is Amy and I have been leading on this project on parliamentary strengthening around addressing online violence against women. So women's empowerment is one of our 5 priority themes at CPA UK, and one of our objectives of this theme is to support parliamentarians to strengthen legislation towards eliminating violence against women and girls within their regions. Funded by the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, CPA UK's virtual roundtable aims to promote gender-sensitive approaches to make online harms legislation and non-legislative measures more effective. The UK government's online safety bill will be used as a case study to highlight lessons and recommendations for other Commonwealth parliamentarians to apply to their respective jurisdictions. And attendees will be equipped with the skills and tools necessary to effectively use gender-sensitive approaches to make responses to online harms more effective. So before I introduce our speakers and begin the roundtable discussion, I'd like to remind our audience of some general housekeeping rules and outline the format of the session. If I could first ask the audience to please remain on mute during the roundtable discussion, but please do make use of the chat function to provide any comments or questions. The event will be recorded so that those unable to attend will be able to watch at a later date. So please do note that by attending the session, you are consenting to being recorded on this channel. The roundtable discussion will last for just over an hour before a Q&A session at the end, where you'll have the opportunity to pose your questions to the speakers. There are no silly questions, so please do ask if you require further information on anything discussed. Also like to remind the audience that this is an apolitical event, so please ensure that comments and questions reflect this. Online harms is a very unusual subject area in that when women parliamentarians are discussing online harms, they're often sharing their experiences, not only as legislators, but also as victims and survivors. So due to the nature of the topic, people may share their own personal experiences. So please do respect this and avoid responding in ways which may cause harm to those also participating. CPA UK staff are on hand to provide any support, whether that be technical or safeguarding. So, without further ado, I am delighted to introduce our brilliant panel of speakers, starting with Commissioner Julie Inman-Grant, who is the E-Safety Commissioner in Australia. In this role, Julie leads the world's first government regulatory agency committed to keeping its citizens safer online. Julie herself has extensive experience in the non-profit and government sectors and spent 2 decades working in senior public policy and safety roles in the tech industry at Microsoft, Twitter, and Adobe. Julie's experience at Microsoft spans 17 years, serving as one of the company's first and longest standing government relations professionals, ending ultimately in the role of Global Director for Safety and Private Policy and Outreach. At Twitter, she set up and drove the company's policy, safety and philanthropy programs across Australia, New Zealand and Southeast Asia. As Commissioner, she's led on work to stand up novel and world-first regulatory regimes under the new Online Safety Act 2021, with implementation of a sweeping new set of reforms beginning on January 2022. And Commissioner Inman-Grant has just been appointed for a further 5-year term by the Australian government in January 2022. Next, we are also joined by the Honourable Maria Miller MP. Maria was first elected as MP for Basingstoke in the 2005 general election. Prior to this, Maria worked for 20 years in marketing, including board-level experience. Maria was appointed Minister for Disabled People at the Department for Work and Pensions in May 2010, and in 2012 was promoted to Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport, and Minister for Women and Equalities. In June 2015, Maria was then elected as the chair of the newly established Women and Equalities Select Committee, overseeing significant reports into the prevalence of sexual harassment against women and girls across a range of settings. Maria campaigns on a range of issues relating to women's equality, including for a 50-50 parliament, the elimination of violence against women and girls, and has been particularly interested in scrutinising online harms and the threat they increasingly pose to women and girls, but also the health of democracies. Our second member of parliament on the panel is the Honourable Anum Kazar. and then was elected as an MP in a 2021 by-election, becoming Scotland's second female Muslim MP. Prior to this, Annan worked as a teacher of modern studies and politics at several schools. Annan currently sits as the Deputy Shadow International Trade Secretary for the Scottish Nationalist Party and sits on the Women and Equalities Committee. In the wake of the racist abuse experienced by Black football players as a result of the 2020 Euros final, Annan called for an urgent debate on real action to end racism in the UK and read out in Parliament some of the harrowing abuse that she has personally faced, which I think draws on very important reflections on the intersection of online misogyny and racism and the experiences of women in politics who have multiple marginalised identities. We are also delighted to welcome Dr. Kim Barker, who is a senior lecturer in law at the Open University Law School, specialising in internet law, including online violence against women, online misogyny, and online hate speech. Dr. Barker's research explores a number of aspects of online text-based abuse, including the consideration of online misogyny as a hate crime, as well as legal regulation of online abuse. And last but not least, we are joined by Hilary Watson, who is the Policy and Campaigns Manager at Glitch. Glitch is a UK charity committed to ending the abuse of women and marginalised people online. Through workshops, training, reports and programmes, they equip a diverse community to become digital citizens we need in the world today. From grassroots to systemic change, they advocate for an online world that is a safe space for all. So, thank you very much to our panel for donating their time and expertise to be with us today. It is hugely, hugely appreciated. And so we will kick things off in the broadest sense. And I'm going to ask panel members to consider what they deem to be the key principles that underpin a good practice response to online violence against women. And I think the clue is in the title, probably, in terms of gender sensitivity, but I'd be really keen for participants to kind of expand on this and outline any other kind of principles that are specific to online harms against women. And if I could start with Honourable Maria Miller to kick things off, please.
Morning, Amy, and thank you so much for that very kind introduction. And it's wonderful to speak to so many people across the Commonwealth. I'm delighted to be able to talk about the measures that are being put in place in the UK. And whilst Australia have very much led the way, and Julie will, I'm sure, talk about the work that she's done, in the UK Parliament, we have just seen the government introduce a new online safety bill, which has been long in the making. Probably a little bit too long in the making for my liking. I wish it was law already. But the key provisions I think that any legislation needs to include is to start from the very basic principles of myth busting. We need to bust the myth that the online world is in some way different to the offline world. It isn't. And the same laws should apply offline as apply online. And I think we can get no better example than when it comes to violence against women and girls, because things which are absolutely already unlawful offline seem to get between the gaps in the online world. And I'll give you one very simple example: cyber flashing. We would call it indecent exposure in the offline world, flashing, which is at the moment in the UK completely and utterly evades the law. So I think the very first thing that you have to do with any legislation is to make it clear that the law is the same online as offline. And you need to have police in place. And in the UK, we're going to be using Ofcom as our police, our regulator. And that, I think, will help show that the new legislation has got teeth. But so the first principle is make sure the law's the same offline as online. But the other principle, I would say, is to make sure that you have filled the gaps in the law, because online law is not as thorough and comprehensive as offline law. I've given you already the example of cyber flashing, but also anonymity and intimate image abuse, where you might see intimate images put online without the consent of the individual involved, being very difficult to take down. At the moment, the law is a patchwork and difficult to implement. So I think that it's really important in every jurisdiction to look at where those gaps in the law are. And also the other area, certainly we have a problem with, is age verification in the UK. The final principle I'll put on the table, Amy, for others to consider, is something which probably doesn't necessarily need legislation, but it needs intent, which is support for victims. If you're going to legislate and you're going to make sure that you've got really strong laws in place, that is for nothing if you don't have support for victims. The UK bill doesn't have measures in place in the legislation, and ministers have assured me that it doesn't need to be in legislation, but you know what, I'll be making sure I get some very, very strong assurances on support for victims when we debate this in the House. So those are my 3 ideas to put on the table, first of all, Amy.
Thank you very much, Honourable Maria Miller, and some really important points there around targeting the issue from the full spectrum in terms of kind of prevention, protection, and the criminalisation. That's great, thank you. If I could hand over to Dr. Kim, please, for your key provisions.
Thanks, Amy, and good morning, everyone. Good evening, everyone, wherever you are across the Commonwealth. So I think, just to follow Maria's comments, really, I think it has to be a holistic approach. First of all, it can't be a kind of piecemeal, take a snapshot here and put a piece of law there. But I would kind of go broader than that. I would say that the most fundamental principle for me is we have to define what we're talking about. So Maria's given the example of cyber flashing and indecent exposure online, offline. I think we need to be really, really clear about the behaviours that we're talking about when we're trying to legislate for online violence against women, in whatever form it might take. Because if we're not clear about it, the legislation is not going to be clear about it. And then we're going to end up in a mess where there's a patchwork, and the patchwork's just going to expand. So for me, definitions, I think, is the first point. And I think the second, probably underpinning principle for online violence particularly, is to treat it as a form of discrimination, because it is. And that is the approach that I would like to see legislation embody, really, when we talk about anything along these lines. So talking about women is a discriminatory issue. We're talking about harm, which comes from the discrimination and which is a perpetuating cycle. So I think we have to take that broad stance when we try and figure out these things, particularly affecting legislation. And if we don't, there's a risk that people fall through the cracks. And then the other non-legislative aspects of it, which you've already kind of touched on, is the support, but also the resourcing that needs to go into that. So it's not just about supporting the victims. I think there's also a huge amount of resourcing that needs to go into the enforcement of the law. Because if there's not enforcement embodied within the principles, there's no point having really good law if nobody's going to do anything about it and use that really good law, if there is really good law. So yeah, I'm prepared to have a debate on it, because I know some people disagree about the discrimination point, but I'm looking forward to seeing what the people have got in terms of a provocation or a response. And I'll leave it there for now.
Fantastic, thank you very much, Dr. Kim. If I could hand over to Commissioner Julia Grant, please.
Sure. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. And I think there are a lot of synergies in terms of approach. And the way I articulate this, because I saw this playing out daily when I was working at Twitter, is that misogynistic abuse is designed to silence voices. And it's hit its mark. And it does serve to entrench gender inequalities that already exist. And we just released some research the other week that really bears that out, in that about 1 in 3 women in their professional lives experience targeted online misogynistic abuse. About a quarter of them will not take leadership opportunities or anything that requires them to be in the media or to be on social media. They're self-censoring, they're going offline. And I think we could all argue now that, you know, the internet is an essential utility. We're going to continue working in a hybrid way. So if we're out there promoting women's voices, we also need to be protecting them too. So I guess I would just say 2 main points, and that is, I don't think that legislative action alone will put a halt to misogynistic abuse online. We do have to take a multifaceted approach that targets the myriad social, cultural, technological drivers. And then we need to balance that. And the approach we take is with three key pillars. The first is through prevention, and this is through research and evidence-based education, outreach, training, and programs targeted at a really broad range of women. There are different kinds and levels of vulnerability, but also covering a spectrum of online harms. And I can talk to you about our two programs later on. eSafety Women, which targets technology facilitated abuse as an extension of coercion and control that is found in almost 99.3% of all domestic and family violence situations. And then a program we have called Women in the Spotlight, which is really about social media self-defense skills for women, particularly women in politics, journalism, advocacy, and those who have intersectional characteristics and are in the public eye. The second, of course, is through protection, and that is through our reporting and investigative schemes. 70% of all reports of abuse that come into our office are from women and girls, including through our image-based abuse scheme and our newer adult cyber abuse scheme. Now, these are civil powers so that women are not forced down an expensive and painful criminal justice pathway. We've got about an 85% success rate in terms of getting image-based abuse down from platforms all over the globe. And where youth-based cyberbullying is involved, we have about a 90% success rate. We're 2 months in with adult cyber abuse, so we'll let you know how that goes. But the third area is in what I call proactive and systemic change. We have these investigative individual complaint schemes, which I think is critical to helping women who are being targeted. But as the approach the UK is taking, we are also aligning with in terms of systematic change and looking at systematic failures, the platforms not enforcing their terms of use consistently and effectively, allowing the creation of fake and imposter accounts, allowing bad actors to go back onto platforms. And we have a strong evidence base that all of these systemic failures are happening as a result of the individual complaint schemes. But it's also through initiatives like Safety by Design, which puts the burden back onto the platforms themselves to anticipate the harms and embed the safety at the front end rather than the back end, and also to anticipate how new and emerging technologies might be weaponized against women, such as deep fakes or even sexual assault in the metaverse. And so how we get ahead of that. The last thing I would say is I really do think we need to take an intersectional lens and recognizing that women from diverse or vulnerable backgrounds will experience abuse at a greater velocity and a tenor and tone. It manifests very differently. And so therefore our responses need to be tailored to that understanding.
That's great. Thank you very much, Commissioner Inman-Grant, and really interesting to hear about kind of the range of mechanisms the eSafety Commission is using to tackle this issue. If I could please hand over to Hilary Watson from Glitch, please, for your contribution.
Great, thank you so much. It's really wonderful to be part of this conversation. I'll come onto the intersectionality points first of all. I absolutely agree. Glitch very much focuses on the women and girls' disproportionate impact, the impact that we have, but particularly focuses on the experiences of Black women. And I think in terms of having a gender-sensitive approach, it's really important not to ignore the intersectional aspect of that. So that firstly is something that very much is driving the work that we're doing in terms of trying to strengthen this kind of legislative approach. And again, coming back to what Maria was saying about not treating the online and offline separately, I think it's very important to not think of online violence against women in isolation. So for example, in the UK, we've just the Home Office has just launched a huge campaign to call, an end to violence against women, but that hasn't got as far as we can see so far, that hasn't got an element which relates to online. And as we've said, there's a new version of the Online Safety Bill, and that hasn't mentioned violence against women. It hasn't mentioned women. So I think, yeah, it's a real disconnect at the moment in terms of seeing the online experience as sort of virtual and sort of belittling that compared to sort of the real experiences, when we know that our lives are completely intertwined, and that's not, you know, how that works. And the last thing I'll say is we're really interested as well in a public health approach to looking at online violence against women and online abuse generally, and also how we can have good digital citizenship education, not just for people in school, people still in you know, educational establishments, but actually for people throughout society, because most of us won't be in those formal education settings anymore yet. We're online all the time.
That's great. Thank you very much, Hilary. And we'll definitely return to those points regarding the UK government's online safety bill in the next question. But in the meantime, can I please go to Honourable Anam for your contribution to this question?
Thank you so much, Amy, for that kind introduction. Good morning and good evening to wherever you are in the world. And just a quick point of clarification, I am a Scottish National Party MP, it's not Scottish Nationalist Party. But it's so lovely to be joined today by friends from the Scottish Parliament as well. I can see some MSPs have joined us, so it's great to see them. I'm going to start off by saying that we really need to see some meaningful change, and I have been involved in a couple of meetings over the last few weeks looking specifically at preventing violence against women and girls, whether that's online or offline, and I am always astounded by the fact that I go into these meetings, whether they're virtual or in person, and that it's just women that are sitting there, because yes, our lived experiences are so important, but men have to be there as well. They have to be listening to us. And I am sick and tired of going into these meetings, to be perfectly frank, and not having any men there, because if they're not going to get involved in the conversation, it's going to be very difficult to shape policy. And the harsh, stark reality is that most men are in positions of power and they need to be listening to us. For far too long, men have got away scot-free with promoting violence against women and girls. And prior to joining this meeting, I was having a look at some statistics. So, for example, a YouGov survey from 2018 found that 41% of women aged between 18 and 36, so that's in my generation age range, have been sent an unsolicited picture of a penis, rising to nearly half of women aged between 18 and 24. Amnesty International a few years ago found that online abuse of women is endemic across all 4 nations of the UK, with around 1 in 5 women having suffered online harassment and abuse. And I've listened to the contributions before me with great interest, and I'm not going to repeat anything that's already been said, but wanted to chat about a few different things. We've spoken about policing and the fact that when we look at the online safety bill, that it'll be Ofcom that's used to police lists. The reality is that this change has to happen and has to come forward, because historically it's been nearly impossible to use traditional policing methods to deal with illegal content promoting violence against women online, and that's simply a bandwidth issue. And platforms must have a responsibility to take down content that is illegal, and I'll go back to this in the second question. But I wanted to speak about my own experiences. As Amy said, that so often when we're in these conversations, it's our own experiences that we'll touch upon. the reality is it's so difficult to be a woman involved in politics, and I'm saying this as a young, so I'm 29 years old, I'm a young woman of colour. I don't know if you can actually see the colour of my skin right now, but I'm from a Pakistani background, and because I just look differently, it means that the abuse that I get online is just exacerbated. And so often people say to me, "Anne, do you think it's a woman?" And I say, well, no, I think it's the reality of having all those different marginalized communities just in one person. So the fact that I'm young, the fact that I'm a woman, the fact that I'm of a colour, the fact that I am identifiably Muslim. And I mean, the misogynistic abuse that women are getting online, particularly women in the public eye, has increased tenfold. And if I'm being perfectly honest, if I had known prior to my election the amount of abuse that I would get simply because I am a young woman of colour, I'm not sure I would have stood for election. And I'll end my contribution there.
Thank you so much, Honourable Anum. And again, as I said before, it is just reminds us when we have these conversations that it is so personal for so many parliamentarians. So thank you so much for sharing that with us today. So I'll move us on to the next question, which is, considering the UK government's online safety bill, how far does this bill go in meeting all the key principles and good practices that we have just discussed? So in other words, how effective is this bill likely to be in its current form in protecting women from online violence? I know this bill has been very recently updated, and I'm also aware, Commissioner Inman Grant, you will not have the entire expertise that our kind of UK speakers will have. So I'm more than happy for you to kind of speak from the Australian experience, but I know you've touched on a lot of those things that the Commission is doing already. So if I could first hand over to Dr. Kim to start us off with this question. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Amy. So first of all, I think the online safety bill is a useful starting point. I don't think it's perfect. I think it is better than nothing. I think we have to provoke the discussion, start the debate, and that has to begin somewhere. And the online safety bill, in its lengthier, most recent form, published fairly recently, is a clear indication that there is at least some strength of coming together to push forward and tackle some of the issues like cyber flashing, like online harms, communications, abusive communications. So I think there is some real merit in the big picture and the broad ambition. That said, I don't think it's perfect, and I think it falls quite short on women specifically in online gender-based abuses, online gender-based violence, online violence against women. I would personally have liked very much to see violence against women specifically mentioned in the bill. I would have liked to see women mentioned in the bill. I would have liked to see discrimination mentioned in the bill, and none of those things really are captured to the extent that I think they perhaps could have been. I think the addition of cyber flashing is useful. I think that is a good starting point, but I think it almost comes a little bit late. It's almost like a bit of an afterthought, and I think more thought, planning, consideration of issues affecting women specifically could have gone into the bill at an earlier stage. It's not too late. There's still time, hopefully, for that to happen. So yeah, there is some hope, I think, is what I'm saying, but I don't think it's perfect. I don't think it's there yet. That said, we don't have specific internet laws for violence against women in the UK, so having the online safety bill as it is a starting point, and we can add to it, can build on it. I'll leave it there for now, see what others have got to say.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kim. If I can hand over to Honourable Maria Miller, please, who I know has been very vocal in Parliament in pushing for all these things that we've been talking about.
Thank you, Amy. And us parliamentarians, we want a bill to tackle everything, don't we? We want to make sure that we've played our part in making the world a safer place. And I think the issue that we face is there is so much that needs fixing in the online world. Inevitably, one piece of legislation is never going to do it all. I'm heartened that this bill in the UK is very clearly sending a message to organisations which, after all, are international, that the notion the online world is a Wild West is at an end. That is for the birds. And I think that's a very good message to send. And why does it do that? Because it puts in place criminal liabilities for organisations that don't abide by the rules, and that is a first, and we shouldn't underplay that. There's also a requirement in the bill to start to look at a proactive approach to the particularly to the moderation of content. So there are good bones being put in place, and there are also really important provisions around the reporting of child sexual abuse. But what it doesn't do is and this is what I will certainly be pushing for, is it doesn't identify how the UK government's going to address the gaps in the law that are clearly there, and particularly as they relate to violence against women and girls. I mentioned earlier online posting of intimate images without consent, which has been subject to a major Law Commission review over the last 3 years, which should finally report in June. Isn't included, the recommendations aren't included in this bill, and there is currently no clarity as to how that and other issues are going to be dealt with. So I think there needs to be almost like a manifesto of intent around gaps in the law, and also how this bill links to the Violence Against Women and Girls strategy. The final point I would say is important, and this isn't necessary in legislation, but also how we're going to ensure that the important issue of prevention is carried through in other policies. We in the UK, after, I have to say, backbench, not ministerial decisions, in 2017 mandated that all school-aged children in the UK would receive sex and relationship education, and an important part of this will be online behaviour. That has been very slow in its rollout, and I, alongside this bill, want to understand how we're going to keep a careful eye on that particular prevention tool to make sure it's as effective as it can be in helping ensure that the online space is, as the government wants it to be, the safest place, that Britain is the safest place in the world to be online. So I think there's lots of elements here which need to be drawn together to ensure the bill is as effective as it can be.
That's great. Thank you very much, Honourable Maria, for that very detailed and comprehensive response. If I could hand over to Honourable Anum now for your contribution.
Thanks, Amy. So I welcome legislation that challenges challenges violence against women and girls. In the online safety bill is a start, but it simply does not go far enough. And there's much that can be built upon. So let's take catfishing, for example. So as I as I understand, there's one of the concerns that my colleagues have raised about on this is that part of the law requires intent. So if someone wanted to send some sort of picture of genitalia or a picture that would cause alarm, distress or humiliation, but if they claim it's for banter or for some other reason other than sexual gratification, it would not be an offence. And this has been criticised by Professor Claire McGlynn, who's an expert on the issue, and she gave evidence to the Joint Committee. But the really, really important thing to think about when we're looking at the online safety bill and the stark reality of it is that when we're looking at harmful content online, it's not just about what's being said, it's about how it's also spread. And we know that platforms will push controversial content through their algorithms because it gains more traction and more engagement. So if you have more engagement, you have more time spent on the platform, you've got more eyeballs on adverts and more money. And content neutral ways of preventing harmful content are less controversial when it comes to freedom of speech. Objections and adding frictions was something that was recommended by Frances Hodgin. Apologies if I mispronounced that. She was one of Facebook's whistleblowers, and it basically means we should be asking people, do you really want to post this before they post it? And this would potentially mean that people would be less likely to spew hateful content, as they would have to consider it before posting it. But also I think we actually need to go back to looking at what exactly the online safety bill looks to do. So effectively what it's trying to do is introduce a duty of care principle. So like if you're in a building site, the people that are there looking after you have a duty of care towards you, and they're basically trying to bring that onto the online world. And what the bill essentially is looking to do is requiring companies to pull together risk assessments on 3 different areas. So the likelihood of illegal content, the likelihood of content that is harmful to children, and the likelihood of content that is harmful to adults. And Ofcom, as I've already said, would be like the police in this sense, and they'll evaluate these risks and the companies' mitigation measures. And if Ofcom then deem companies to have failed in their duties, they can issue fines as well as criminal sanctions. And as I say at the very start, I welcome legislation that challenges violence against women and girls. And there are some good parts of it. So for example, the government's finally listened to children's rights campaigners. But the stark reality is, as the speakers prior to me have already said, there is a lack of specific focus on abuse currently experienced by women, particularly if you're from a Black and ethnic minority community.
Thank you very much, Honourable Anam. And if I could hand over to Hilary now, please. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, I think what I'll focus on first is that online abuse is such, and online violence against women is such a gendered issue. And we know from other work on gendered issues that you can't have a gender neutral solution to such a gendered problem. So again, this piece of legislation is missing the inclusion of women, girls, gender, and violence against women, and without prioritising online violence against women, companies won't be prioritising it. They'll be prioritising the things that are named in the bill that they have to. Again, on the intersectionality and how we make sure that the bill is appropriate in that sense. And as we've said, we've got a sort of brand new version of the bill, and from our analysis we thought that the previous version actually had a clause, just a few words, which suggested that it could have an intersectional approach, and that clause has been removed and nothing's been said about it. We don't know if that's been done sort of deliberately at this point, but it's just another point that it's sort of a step back, and rather than getting into the minutiae of the detail of what we are lobbying on in terms of strengthening the bill, we're going back to having to argue that women and girls should be included, and also that intersectionality needs to be part of it. So I think probably there's a line about how membership of a group, but the fact is that many of us are in multiple groups which are disproportionately impacted by online violence against women, and that really needs to be recognised in the bill. Another concern that I have at the moment in terms of the rhetoric around the bill maybe is that we have seen news grabbing headlines about things like cyber flashing, and those provisions are greatly needed, but often it seems like the word cyber flashing is used as a synonym for online violence against women and girls, and the whole wide spectrum of violence against women is being ignored essentially because we're talking about this one very specific element of it. So that's been quite a concern. What I will say is that there's a combination of approaches in terms of dealing with specific content, but also systemic changes and systemic tools. And I think the media headlines have been looking at the content sort of approach, and the systemic details are there, but they aren't necessarily getting the same pickup in the media. So there has been some good progress there. So I think probably the bill is, as it is, may well do quite a lot to make the internet safer, for example, for children in a sort of gender neutral way. But children are currently named 390 times in the bill, and yet girls are never named, or a gendered perspective on that's never named. And I think that's missing as well, especially as we have evidence, for example, from Girl Guiding in the UK, which shows that online experiences of girls are sort of negative and increasingly negative as they get older. So ignoring the gendered nature just again sort of ignores that experience, and I think that's very much needed as well.
Thank you very much, Hilary. And I'll now hand over to Commissioner Imran Grant to kind of reflect on Australia's experience of their legislation now that it's in force.
Right. Well, I will never pretend to be an expert on the online safety bill, but I was just in the UK in December, and we've been meeting quite a bit with DCMS and Ofcom. And first of all, I think it's really important that the UK is putting a stake in the ground here. And what we learned, we started 7 years ago in 2015 as the Children's E-Safety Commissioner. And we had two major regulatory schemes, one around online content, so taking down all forms of illegal content, but focused on child sexual abuse material. And then the second was a novel new scheme around youth-based cyberbullying. So if a young person experienced anything seriously humiliating, intimidating, harassing, or threatening, if they report it to a social media site and it doesn't come down, then they report it to us and we serve as that safety net. So we're not trying to be the content moderators of the internet. It's the platform's job to enforce their terms of service, but we know things fall through the cracks, and inevitably it is those cultural factors that fall through the cracks. And as I said before, 80% of our youth-based cyberbullying comes from girls. It starts at around the age of 8 or 9. But interestingly, girls are also more likely to use what we call relational bullying tactics against other girls. So creating rumors, starting drama, excluding other children from activities or parties, that sort of thing, which of course is very insidious because it's humiliating and it's very visible to a child and their peers, but almost hidden to adults. So using the success of that scheme, we actually moved into the adult realm with image-based abuse, and about 30% of our reports are from young people, scenarios where sexting has gone wrong. But again, 70% of the reports are from women. And part of the challenge about image-based abuse, I made a very conscious choice when we started up the scheme, not to call it revenge porn. Revenge for what? Porn, sort of trivialize it, makes it sound like it's for someone's titillation. And it's inherently victim blaming. We should be focused on the perpetrator and the predator and what they're doing to try and humiliate another person without consent. And the reason it impacts women more than it impacts men is there's still gender double standards about, this is like the scarlet letter for the digital age, right? So while we don't have gender specific language in our legislation, we are able to pivot and to focus on the communities that we know are more vulnerable, including the genders or even gender fluid people that are more vulnerable. So of course we've built out, we now have an adult serious cyber abuse scheme, which has been controversial for those on the digital rights side, but this is really clearly information that's going into the realm of serious intent to harm and is a menacing, harassing, and offensive in all cases. So we're able to help people individually, and we are moving towards what we call the basic online safety expectations, which is very much like the duty of care that the UK is looking at. But I think an interesting thing to consider is that we don't know whether or not these systemic processes are really going to be effective. I mean, when you think about how targeted abuse manifests, it tends to be against a person, often a group, or a person because they represent a particular group, and we can provide that immediate relief. But you know, how there are going to be some really big penalties and some, you know, wonderful powers Ofcom's going to have that I'm very covetous of. So I think we're all going to need to work together to see what actually impacts. And I think it's going to be a combination of a number of these at the individual level, at the systemic level, at the voluntary level, at the mandatory level, at the criminal level, at the civil level. So we have to look at this holistically, but more importantly, we have to work together because we will have different legislative tools and different strengths and different experiences. We need to get together and counter the will, the wealth, and the might of the technology industry, but also really talk to each other about whether or not our laws are having deterrent effects so that we can mirror that happening from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, and because we need to target human behavior, frankly, too.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much, Commissioner Imran, and some really important points there, especially in terms of working together. That's something at CPA UK we always try to facilitate with programs like this to get these very important conversations going. So I will move on to our final question now before we can discuss some of the questions raised in the chat, and that is bringing in the parliamentary angle. We have many parliamentarians in the audience who I'm sure will be keen to hear how they can apply gender-sensitive scrutiny to their government's proposals, and how they can also advocate for gender-sensitive approaches to online harms. I'm aware we only have 2 parliamentarians in our panel, but essentially parliamentarians often inform their scrutiny with the views of non-governmental organisations and academics, and they draw on that kind of strong set of evidence. So I think it will be really interesting to hear a contribution from everyone on this point. And if I could start off with Honourable Maria Miller again, please.
Thank you, Amy. And I mean, inevitably, when we're looking at legislation, we're making sure that we think very firmly about how effective it is and how it is going to really advantage those that have been most disadvantaged. And when it comes to the online world, women have disproportionately been affected by online harm. When I look at this legislation, I will be making sure that the legislation goes as far as it can to identify that disproportionate effect on women. And this is something we did recently with the domestic abuse bill that was passed in the UK Parliament. And it was subject to that bill, the same as the online safety bill, was subject to across Parliament review by the House of Lords and House of Commons. And we very firmly felt that there should be recognition within that bill of the very gendered nature of domestic abuse. And I think that the same arguments can be leveled here with regards to online harm as well. Why is that important? Because when it comes to those who have responsibility to ensure the law is not breached, those people who are running these online social media spaces, I hope that that will prompt them to particularly look at the impact on women and put in place bespoke support to ensure that those problems are dealt with. So I do think that we need to, within the bill, recognise the disproportionate impact on women, so that we can make sure that those who are making sure that the law acts in practice will do so as well. So that was just an initial thought on that.
That's great. Thank you very much, Honourable Maria. And if I could hand over to Dr. Kim, please, if you had any thoughts on this last point.
Yeah, thanks, Amy. I think fundamentally there needs to be scrutiny across the board of the bill to make sure it's effective, but I think there needs to be a very clear lens on that for what people, including members of this panel, have identified as missing from that bill. And I think if there is a focus on what the bill is aiming to achieve for everybody, including women, not just children, adults generally, but women in particular, and that is borne in mind through the scrutiny processes, then there is real scope to improve the bill, any bill. But I think first and foremost, keep in mind the bigger picture. Who is the bill for? What is it supposed to do? And if you keep that as a kind of objective when anybody is scrutinising the bill, then that should give a clear steer on what needs to happen to make it effective. And effective legislation is what we're interested in. There's no point having it if it's not effective.
Great, thank you very much, Dr. Kim. If I could hand over to Honourable Annam, please.
Thanks. So I'm going to answer this in two parts. First, the legislative, then non-legislative side, because I think both are equally as important. So from a legislative aspect, of course, when bills are going through Parliament, they'll be scrutinised via committees and through debates. But as was indicated earlier, I sit on the Women and Equalities Committee, and it is so important that when we're challenging violence against women and girls, that we hear from those with lived experiences, because that was exactly what will help us shape policy. And further to that, of course, taking evidence from experts is all fair and well as parliamentarians talking about what we think, but actually listening to those experts who have that in-depth knowledge, who can come back to us and say, well, actually, look, this is what needs to be strengthened, is incredibly important. And of course, when we're looking at pieces of legislation like the online safety bill, is ensuring that we have strong lines of communication, strong lines of communication with our devolved government. So of course, as you can tell from my accent, I'm from Scotland, and we have our own Scottish Parliament and our own Scottish Government, and it's really important that those lines of communications are open and transparent to ensure that we are all working towards tackling violence against women and girls. And then from a non-legislative aspect, and this is something that I've spoken about quite a lot actually in Parliament, something that I'm really, really passionate about is the idea of education, because we know that when men act in misbehaviour, it's normally learnt behaviour, and that can also stem from a very young age. So when I'm talking about a very young age, I'm not talking about teenage years, I'm thinking primary school level, at the ages of 5 and 6, when violence against women and girls is just so normalised at that age. And I'm going to tell you an example of something that happened offline that then went online. So earlier last year, a footballer in Scotland, David Goodwillie, moved football club. And when it was announced that he was moving football club, it came out again that he had been gone through, so he went through a criminal court and was found not guilty of rape, but when the victim took him to a civil court, and this was the very first time this happened in Scotland, when she took him to a civil court, he was found guilty, and I think he had to pay a fine. So he is known to be a rapist. That is public knowledge. He moved football club, quite rightly so. Women and men all across Scotland were exacerbated. They were confused at why this had happened. But when it was challenged online, specifically by female parliamentarians, it was really interesting to see the level of abuse that they got. And for that football team, and I mean, I'm not a football fan, so I'm not sure if it was Wraith Rovers, but I think it was. But, women from that football team resigned in protest. And after they resigned in protest, they got abuse online. And it is so important from a non-legislative aspect that we are ensuring that there is education continually from a very young age all the way up to ensure that we're tackling violence against women, because we have to be in a position where we're using people like footballers or musicians to help us challenge violence against women, but equally, when they're guilty, we're holding them to account.
Thank you very much, Honourable Anam. And if I could hand over to Hilary, please, for your response to this question.
Yes, thank you. And yeah, thank you very much for discussing that. Anam, that's a really important point. Yeah, I think in terms of what we've seen from debates in the UK Parliament, there have been a lot of really strong debates that have recognised the gendered nature of online abuse, both from women parliamentarians, but also men who've recognised that. So that's a really strong indication of what we could have going forward in terms of debating this piece of legislation. We want that, of course, to translate into the legislation in a meaningful way, so we do improve the experiences of women online. So by that, I mean that we want a gender-sensitive approach embedded throughout the regime. So for women and girls and online violence against women to be on the face of the bill, to be part of the mandatory codes of practices, for Ofcom to have a really key understanding of what we mean, what the issues are, the research that's coming from specialist charities and researchers and organisations who do work with people with lived experience, and also speaking with people with lived experience, for example, so you can see that those gaps that we've talked about earlier, for example, with intent, with cyber flashing, that's all reflected. So yes, I echo a lot of what the other speakers have said, but essentially I think the understanding of the problem is strong. It's just we need to ensure that how the bill progresses will, for example, improve women in public life, in public and political life, their experiences exponentially, and it not being a silencing kind of tactic, but also it not affecting women without public profiles as well. So it's really important that women with those high profiles and women without, again, have a much better experience in our online spaces.
That's great. Thank you very much, Hilary. And I can finally hand over to Commissioner Inman-Grant to respond on this point around gender-sensitive scrutiny of legislation.
Thank you so much. As parliamentarians, you hold such a crucial role in society, being at the forefront of creating both laws and regulatory responses that will keep your constituents, including women, safer in the digital world. And based on this conversation, I can tell that you all take this responsibility very seriously. And we've heard that not only is a gendered lens required, but so is an intersectional lens, and that the responses need to be strengths-based, trauma-informed, and culturally safe and appropriate. And I hope I've been able to convey that regulators need to be empowered with a multifaceted regulatory remit, which gives them both the powers and functions to protect women online, engage in these co-design processes, but to also hold perpetrators to account and increase accountability for digital platforms. We commend you here in Australia for taking this really important step. And I do think it's important to remember that this is not a women's issue we're talking about, but a societal issue. And we all have a really important role to play. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Commissioner Inman-Grant. So Do any members of the panel have any other contributions they'd like to make that they feel we haven't covered before we start off with the Q&A session? I will take your silence as a no. That's great. Okay, so we have just over 15 minutes remaining for the Q&A session. So could I please encourage members of the audience to raise their hand if they'd like to pose a question, or post one in the chat box if they haven't already. And if I could first go to Ruth Forrest, who has posted her question in the chat. I'd just like to invite you, Ruth, to open your mic and open your camera to pose your question to the panel.
Hi, do you want me to read the question out? Excuse me, read the question out?
Please do, yes. Thank you.
Yeah. So what I was saying is I'm from Tasmania in Australia, and in the Parliament there as a member of Parliament in our state upper house. I've got a motion before the House at the moment, which will debate next week, or 2 weeks, sorry. I'm trying to establish a Gender and Equalities Committee. So a joint House committee, so hopefully we'll get the support for that. But the question I have around this is the law is quite a blunt instrument, and programs to assist women are essential, obviously, and I know the Commissioner spoke about that. But I'm interested to know how and when primary prevention should be approached, and what evidence-based programs there might be, or models that are in place that could be adopted. Because as talked about, legislation is one aspect, but you need a whole societal response around this, because legislation on its own won't do it.
Thank you very much, Ruth. If I could invite any members of the panel to respond to that, please. Yes, Honourable Maria.
Well, first, can I wish Ruth every success in establishing her committee? We did that a couple of years ago in Parliament, and it's worked very well. In terms of prevention, one of the preventative measures that we're taking in the UK Parliament is, as I said earlier, to make relationship and sex education mandatory for all school-age children. And in doing that, the intention behind it is to address head-on not only the rights of people to be online safely, but also the responsibilities associated with that. One thing that I want to put into the online safety bill is scrutiny of how effective that relationship and sex education is going to be, because it's pointless having measures in place if you don't then check how effective they've been. It has been controversial to make relationship education mandatory for 5-year-olds, but it is exactly for these reasons around online safety that we believe it's the right thing to do. Thank you.
Just on that point, if I might, it was interesting. In my former life, I was a nurse and midwife, and I used to do sex education in schools. And we did start with kindergarten and prep and right through, just really to talk about, the personal safety. This is before online safety was even an issue. I've been around a while.
Ruth, this is Julie. 94% of Australian 4-year-olds are given access to a digital device. So this comes back to that whole idea of a holistic approach. So we've got an under 5s program for parents and early childhood centers, but we have to connect the home. We have to talk early and often. We have to start early. We talk a lot about the 4 R's of the digital age: respect, responsibility, creating digital resilience, and critical reasoning skills. But I agree with Maria about the importance of evaluation. And in fact, today we just had a roundtable with Chanel Contos and Sex Discrimination Commissioner Kate Jenkins about respectful relationships education, and because we need to take things off. I think the one thing UK really has going for it is that you have a singular national education system. We have states and territories, plus Catholic schools, public schools, and independent schools. So the challenge is that one, evaluation, but two, that kids and young people and even adults aren't getting this consistently and effectively. And this also goes to teacher education. So pre-service teacher training, making sure that, we know what resonated with us when we were in school and learning. And a lot of teachers aren't equipped or comfortable talking about these subjects. So we need to train them as well. But I'm happy to talk to you offline too, Ruth, if you'd like.
Thanks, Julie. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much for your question, Ruth, and thank you to our panel for their responses. If I could hand over next to Elena Whittam, MSP, for her question around the Misogyny Act in Scotland. Oh, I apologise, you're still on mute at the moment.
Thank you very much for that, Amy, and sorry for that. And thanks very much for having this event this morning. So I do have an interest in understanding how this would interact with any, proposed Misogyny Act that we have in Scotland at the moment, from a working group that was set up and led by Dame Helena Kennedy. But also to understand, my background is a women's aid worker, was a women's aid worker for over 10 years. And I'm the convener of the Scottish Parliament Social Justice Committee, who has an oversight of the Equally Safe strategy, which is about eradicating violence against women and girls. And I have a great desire to see how we actually mainstream equalities effectively within parliaments. So not just looking at the legislation that we have, but how do we actually apply that gendered lens to every decision that we take, right through budgeting, right through strategies, etc. And I have a huge interest and drive to figure out how do we actually tackle online pimping, pornography, all of those things that you can actually pull together and understand why women are still subjected to what we're subjected to in a day-to-day basis. So it's understanding the intersectionality of all of that stuff, but interested specifically to understand how a bill within the UK Parliament, as is proposed, will actually interact with a standalone misogynistic offence that could be created in Scotland. And is that type of standalone offence the way that we need to go generally across the world in terms of tackling misogyny? Thank you.
If I could again open that question up to the panel to respond, please. Yes, Dr. Kim, please do go on.
Thanks, Amy. Thanks also for the question. So I think there's a whole lot of work to unpack around misogyny and the misogyny offence and whether or not it is the way to go or otherwise. And not least because how do you define misogyny and how do you show intent for misogyny when it's based on discrimination, which is systemic and embedded in society and structures. So without going down that rabbit hole, potential interaction between a proposed Misogyny Act in Scotland and the Online Safety Bill, yes, but not all of the Online Safety Bill will apply in Scotland. And if it's based on hate, then it will fall within the hate crime framework, and that should interact with the Online Safety Bill, but it might not necessarily do that in the way that we might want it to. The Scottish picture is slightly more complicated by the changes to hate crime in Scotland and how that will interact with misogyny as well. So in a perfect world, there would be joined up thinking across the board to deal with misogyny, online, offline, online violence, women and girls' safety generally, online and offline. But I don't think actually what we've got yet is joined up thinking, which is a shame really, because all of these things have come together and they've come together at the right time, but they haven't necessarily come together in the right way as a concerted, holistic effort. And I think that's perhaps where there's some more work to do. I'm quite happy to follow up that discussion on Scotland specifically, because I've been doing a lot of work on Scotland separately.
That's great. Thank you very much, Helena, and thank you very much, Dr. Kim, for your response there. If I could hand over to our next question, which I apologise, I can't read your Zoom name. It says Berlin L2. I'm sure that's not your actual name, but yes, if I could ask you to pose your question to the panel, please. Thank you.
Sorry, I should have changed that. I'm Johan Bellin. I work for Plaid Cymru member, the Welsh National Party, Rhys Bowen, who's our Justice and spokesperson in the Welsh Parliament. Obviously, we're curtailed somewhat by what we can do legislatively, but so I was wondering what non-legislative routes that other sub-state national parliaments have used to respond to online harms. Maybe the panel and maybe other members of the Roundtable would know.
Thank you very much. Can I open that question up to the panel or any other participants on the roundtable?
I would say, of course, when the Australian Parliament set up the Online Safety Act, there was an idea that it would mostly be predicated on the regulatory schemes. And that, of course, that's a big part of what we do. Coming in as the leader of this agency, I thought about what is the holistic approach we need to take to actually have longer term impact and prevent the harms from happening in the first place. So that goes back to my comment about making sure that Parliament is looking at resourcing fundamental research so you can conduct a baseline looking at things like online safety education, pedagogy, and so understanding what actually works and evaluating those programs at the end, making sure we've got programs where we train frontline workers in the domestic violence sector to be able to identify technology facilitated abuse, whether it's gaslighting or a drone flying over a safe house, or we've even seen situations where a woman's car would stall when she went more than 1 kilometer beyond her own home. So being able to have these programs are important, but also being able to, and I talked about systemic change and being able to stay a step ahead of technology and emerging trends. So that because policy is always going to outpace, technology is always going to outpace policy. And so we need to be thinking about how can deep fakes be weaponized against women? What does sexual assault in the metaverse look like? What does this idealized view of Web 3.0 decentralized world look like when there are no gatekeepers and there's no way to remediate harm? And we need to be planning for those governance structures and making sure that these companies are building in safety, privacy, and security protections now rather than later. So I think we have to work on all three domains to be successful globally, or nationally in this area. Otherwise, we're just going to be playing a game of whack-a-mole and responding through harms regulation after the damage has been done. There may be some deterrent effect, but that'll take a while to kick in.
Yes, Hilary, please. Thank you very much, Commissioner Ingram.
Yeah. So if I could say about Wales and the particular context. So there's the Violence Against Women, Domestic Abuse and Sexual Violence Act, which has been in place for quite a few years. And there have been some really strong public awareness campaigns around various types of violence against women and domestic abuse and sexual violence. And I think it would be very helpful if there were campaigns around online violence against women, and really we do need a sort of public awakening, not only of the help that people can get and the experiences that shouldn't be tolerated, but also to have these behavioural changes. For example, people might think that comments they make online don't have meaningful impacts in people's lives. So I think there's already a strong foundation in Wales already in terms of public health campaigns related to the Bad RSV Act. I think as well with the relationship and sexuality education work that's been going on in the last few years as well, that of course is a real bedrock for these conversations that we can be having from sort of the age of 3 right up to the older people in our educational institutions. And as well, in terms of the violence against women sector in Wales, it will be very aware of all of these issues and will be dealing with them all the time. It's just that these are additional tactics of violence against women on top of what they've been dealing with for the last 40 years. So again, further resources for the specialist violence against women sector is also massively key in terms of being able to tackle this in Wales.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for that response, Hilary. And if I could hand over to Rhoda Grant, MSP, a question relating to, again, the Online Safety Bill and Scottish law.
Sorry, had a bit of a problem unmuting myself.
No problem.
I just wonder if there are ways around this in the online safety bill. I'm co-convener of the cross-party group on commercial sexual exploitation in the Scottish Parliament, and we carried out an inquiry onto online sexual exploitation. Now, my understanding is that the bill as it stands does have some measures about sexual exploitation with regard to controlling and inciting prostitution in the bill, but that only applies to England and Wales. It doesn't apply to Scotland. And I think that's just kind of the way that the legislation has been set up. But I'm wondering if the quick fix to this, if there is such a thing as a quick fix, is to ensure that anything that is illegal in the normal run of the course would be illegal online. So, for instance, if we did have a misogyny bill, if we did have a bill against online pimping in Scotland, that would be automatically covered by the bill. Could there be a catch-all in it to stop different legislation? It's quite normal for the UK Parliament to legislate on Scottish areas of competence with a legislative consent motion through. So it's not because, but there is a grey area between online and what is devolved to Scotland. So I'm just looking for fixes to that.
If I could again open that up to the panel to respond. Yes, Dr. Kim, please. Thank you.
I like the idea of a quick fix. I'm not sure there is a quick fix. I think partly the way it's been done in terms of the geographical extent relates to the communications reform discussions that are going on more broadly. And I think a large part of that feeds into where the extent is maybe curtailed a little bit for Scotland versus England, Wales, and the rest of the UK. So yeah, while I like the idea of a quick fix, I think we need to be very careful that a catch-all is maybe not too broad to catch too many things and do nothing effectively, and that it works within what already exists in devolved systems of law. So it doesn't duplicate, but it also doesn't make the patchwork system worse, if that makes sense. And there are other discussions going on that will affect some of the things in the online safety bill in England, Wales, Scotland as well. So it's not a straightforward answer, and it's not really an answer, but it's just that I like the idea, and I think there needs to be a bit more thinking done around it, which I can appreciate it's not that helpful in terms of a quick fix. But yeah, I think we need to be careful about how we do it if we're going to make it work for people.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Dr. Kim, and thank you for your question. So I think we have time for the one question left remaining, and then we will close the session. So if I could hand over to Honourable Hack for her question, please. Apologies, you're still on mute, I'm afraid.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now. Thank you.
As it is evident from this discussion that women from all around the world are facing the same kind of misogynistic attitude or discrimination, and that is just the way it is. I mean, yeah. And this, just a minute, please. As it is evident, the digital world has opened up a parallel universe for all of us, and though it's empowering individuals, but at the same time, we are facing the same kind of, the abuse, especially, and the abuse is more violent, as it is as the nature of this abuse is the nature, and the predators are anonymous in this field. So we are just fighting with these anonymous predators, and it is making us more harder to fight them and to bring them to justice. So my suggestions is that whether we can make, since the expert panel is here, I would like to, ask your opinion that if we could, open our social account with the national ID, which should be which should not be made public. It will be kept secret, but when it's needed, the regulator could access them, and when the when it's in extreme cases, and bring them to justice and address the problem. I mean, that's my suggestions.
Thank you very much for your question. If I could hand over to Honourable Maria, please, for your response.
I think that's such an important issue, and for many of us, it is the anonymous abuse which can be the worst, although I have to say, not all abuse that is potentially unlawful is anonymous. But as a result of the problems around anonymity, I've been campaigning hard for the online safety bill to tackle in the UK, to tackle that head on by making sure that there is a way of verifying the identity of individuals who use social media. I think there are some strong and quite compelling arguments for some people to be able to use social media in an anonymous way. So this has to be dealt with very carefully. But I think that there is overwhelming need for verification of identity, and there are going to be clear measures, or there are clear measures in the UK online safety bill to clamp down on anonymous trolls, and really importantly to give people more control over who can contact them and what they see online. At the moment, the default is that that there is no control over anonymous individuals contacting you, and that is one of the key things that's going to change. So will it get rid of all abuse? No, because much of the abuse I see on my own online account is not anonymous at all, and hence the cultural change is required. But for those anonymous trolls who are causing huge harm, potentially putting particularly women off coming forward and standing for election, as we heard earlier, then I think these measures will start to to make sure that anonymous trolls are not going to be putting people off in the same way as they have in the past.
Thank you very, very much, Honourable Maria. And if I could hand over to Commissioner Imran Grant, please.
Yeah, I think this is a very live issue, and this is one that we're looking at as well. And I do think it's important to remember, one, that you can never be totally anonymous on the internet in many cases, particularly those who are hurling online abuse or pseudonymous. The challenge we all have is the major online platforms literally have billions of accounts, social media accounts, that they haven't collected identity, they don't have any information on. So how do you go back and re-identify all those people? And I think it's also important that we recognize that there are good reasons for anonymity. You know, if you're a domestic violence victim, if you're a whistleblower, if you're living under a repressive regime, even if you're an LGBTQI child who is trying to explore their sexual identity and may live in a very conservative household, for instance. So we need to make sure that we're not taking a sledgehammer to the nut, and what we're really trying to do is prevent people from using identity shielding mechanisms to abuse other people. So part of that has to go back on to the responsibility of the platforms again. If you have, if you're highway patrol and there's somebody speeding, the police pull them over and they give them a ticket or a violation. What we're not seeing is the platforms doing this consistently. So as they're seeing abuse and pulling up violations, that's when they need to start thinking about how do we what kind of information do we collect? How do we store it securely and privately? So that regulators like Ofcom and e-safety, when we have cause and we have legal process, can go to the platforms and say, so that we can fulfill our investigations and fulfill our enforcement actions. Sadly, today, when we go to the platforms, the information they have is very spotty. So it's going to require, I think, a longer term set of solutions. It's a really challenging problem, and we just need to make sure that we're not, again, hitting the nut with the sledgehammer, and so that we're maximizing the good and we're minimizing the bad.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Inman-Grant. And I'm very sad to say it's time to draw the session to a close, as we are already over time. I'm sure we could talk about this subject for hours and hours and hours, as there's such a range of things to discuss, but I'm sure CPA UK will be hosting many events like this in the future. So I'd like to thank our expert panel of speakers who donated their time and expertise to contribute to the discussion. And thank you to our audience who have joined us to learn and contribute their questions. I hope both sides found the session useful and will share what they've learned with others to keep this very important conversation going. So as you may be aware, at CPA UK, we always hope to achieve tangible outcomes from our projects and programmes, and one way of doing so is asking parliamentarians to commit to a pledge to take forward within their own work. So I'm just going to ask my colleague to set up a poll from which you'll be able to select a practical pledge which you can action within your own jurisdiction and share with your colleagues. Finally, at CPA UK, we'd be incredibly grateful if before you leave the session today, you were able to complete the following post-assessment form, which I will now post in the chat. These forms enable us to assess how we can improve our programmes and make them more relevant to your roles. It will take less than 5 minutes to complete, what will be really, really helpful for us at CPA UK. So I appreciate you are all incredibly busy people. So thank you again very much to our panel, who I will let go to enjoy the rest of their days. And thank you again, everyone, for joining us here today.